Hi everybody. So, as Norbert mentioned, I'm Tiffany Jernigan, and I work at Amazon as a developer advocate on pretty much everything related to containers. I am also one of the organizers of this meetup. So, thanks for coming. So, today I'm going to talk about Fargate, and Fargate is a launch type for our existing service, Amazon Elastic Container Service, or ECS, if any of you have heard of it before. And it doesn't require any previous experience to start using Fargate. So I want to start a little bit with our journey. So let's start with Amazon EC2. So before we had any container services at AWS, people would go and package their application and run it along with their operating system into what we would call an Amazon machine image, which is also AMI for short, or AMI depending on how people like saying it. And then they would just run that on EC2. And then Docker came along. So people started running their applications in containers. And then they started using Docker to run those containers within EC2 instances. This allowed people to break up their applications into multiple parts. It made it safer for people to run multiple applications on the same instance. And it also resulted in people not needing to worry about the underlying operating system. So those containers were then used to build and scale applications in the cloud on, say, AWS. So the container image generally has everything that you need to run your application, and since containers can be run basically anywhere, it made it very easy to scale. So then once people started scaling those, customers needed a way to go and scale their large clusters. It became hard to manually do it themselves, and it resulted in people needing a service to keep the state of the instances, to manage the instances, to figure out how much available resources were still there. And we thought this is too much work for people. They shouldn't be worrying about managing a cluster and building the cluster management software. So we wanted to provide that for them, and it should just be about the application. So with that came Amazon Elastic Container Service, or ECS. So we launched it to provide a scalable and secure way to manage and scale the deployment of Docker containers on AWS. It basically removed the need for customers to run their own management software and provided a hosted service with tight integration with the existing EC2 features that they liked from before. So to ensure that people could run on any workload that they had, we provided containers running on Amazon ECS with integration with many of the existing AWS services such as CloudWatch, load balancers. We created AWS VPC for networking, the IAM roles for security. And we also had advanced task placement strategies such as bin packing. And then you can also have the option of managing via the console, or we have two different CLIs available. There's the ECS CLI and the AWS CLI. However, so you no longer have to worry about creating your own cluster management software, but you still have to worry about maintaining and patching like the Docker daemon, your operating system, your ECS agent. We wanted to remove the need for people to have to do that as well. They were also still worrying about like the instance fleet that hosted your applications. And if you looked in those instances as well as having the Docker daemon, the agent, you had to worry about other system level libraries that you had. So the real picture looks something like this. You have all of your EC2 instances, and then you have Amazon ECS, which is dealing with scheduling and orchestration. But people just wanted to run their containers. They didn't want to have to worry about what version they have of Docker, etc. So to fix that, we created AWS Fargate. So AWS Fargate is just a part of ECS. It's one of the options that you have. It enables you to do exactly that. You just worry about tasks, which are a grouping of containers, and you don't have to worry about all the other versions because ECS will do it for you. So, as I mentioned, it's managed by AWS. You don't have to worry about the EC2 instances anymore. You don't have to worry about scaling them. You don't have to manage them. And it's elastic. We have load balancers. You can easily scale up or scale down. And then you only have to pay for what you're using. So for ECS, you would pay for the instances, and here you end up paying for each task. And like ECS in general, it is also fully integrated with a bunch of existing AWS services, such as CloudWatch, Elastic Load Balancing, IAM, etc. So let's look at the existing container services landscape. So we have the cluster management layer that I was just talking about, which has ECS in it. We also give an option of Amazon Elastic Container Service for Kubernetes, which is in preview. And then we also have the hosting layer options. There is EC2, which is what Amazon ECS was just running on before. And then we now have AWS Fargate. And then with that, if you want to have a registry to host your images in, we have Amazon Elastic Container Registry for ECR. And then soon we will be having EKS with the Fargate. So for this talk, I'm just going to focus on Amazon ECS with AWS Fargate. Alright, so these are going to be the concepts that I'll be going over today. Like, I discussed a little bit earlier about why we decided to build Fargate and how it makes it a lot easier for customers. So now I want to talk about using AWS Fargate in action. So how many people here have used ECS before? Okay, cool, quite a few people. Alright, so some of this may be review then for those people. I'm going to go into some of the ECS primitives. So first we have a task definition. So when I mentioned tasks, which are groupings of containers, you create a task definition, which is a JSON document, and in that you describe what containers you want to have and all the things that you need for that to run your containers. So in your task definition, you will have like an image name, an image URL, how much memory and CPU. So then we also have this concept of a cluster. So it can be just viewed as like an isolation boundary. And then within those clusters, we have tasks that you can run. One of the options is you can run a task. So if you run a task and your task dies for some reason, then you go and restart the task. And we have launch types. So we have EC2 and Fargate. So another option for running your tasks is to create a service. So creating a service, basically you say how many copies you want to have running, and ECS will ensure that that many are always running. And then you can also use Elastic Load Balancing with it. So for the people who have used ECS before, it's the same task definition schema that you were used to writing before. There are just some new parameters that you can add to it. You are still using the same ECS APIs to launch your Fargate containers. So you're just using the same constructs that you had before, which helps make it easier to migrate between Fargate and EC2. So this is just like a tiny snippet of a task definition. So a task definition, as I mentioned, it's in JSON. You can have up to 10 containers per task definition. And then each of those containers within a task, they're all located on the same host. So say for this task definition, it's for Nginx. It's just, you have the task name, and then you have your list of container definitions. You can have multiple in here. This one just is Nginx. So you'd have like your name, the image URL, and then there's a bunch of other things, but we'll get into that in a bit. So let's take a look into the compute, how the configuration for CPU, memory, and then how pricing works for Fargate. So running ECS, like itself, doesn't cost any extra money. So you only pay for what you used. So yeah, with EC2 you pay for each instance. With Fargate you pay for the memory CPU for your tasks. So we have task level resources, and the little snippet on the right is from a task definition as well, and it's using 1 vCPU and 2 gigabytes. You can also have container level resources if you want, which you can also do in EC2 mode. And then billing is on a per second level. So we have several different configurations for you out there. Just like with instances, there are a bunch of different sizes, etc. that you can have. So we have the different CPUs and memory, and if you want to see how much it costs, you can just look on our website. Okay, so let's take a look into networking now. So I mentioned earlier that there was AWS VPC networking. So that is what Fargate uses. And then you can still take advantage of many of the other powerful features that ECS has, and such as like the VPC and the security groups. And you can create security groups for each of your tasks. Okay, so here's another little snippet from a task definition. So in the task definition for Fargate, for networking, you just have to add the AWS VPC network mode. And then if you're running it using the AWS CLI, you have to specify the subnets and the configuration. There's a way how you can click this in the console, which I'll show a bit later. Fargate also supports application load balancers and network load balancers. You can just use them the same way that you could in ECS. So we talked about security a bit. We talked about VPCs. Well, let's also go into IAM roles. So with that, we have several permission tiers. So we have 3 different layers of permission tiers. There's the cluster level, which has permissions for what you can run on the cluster. You can have application permissions, which are for actions that you expect your application to do. And then we also have housekeeping. So that's for things that you want ECS to do for you, such as integration with CloudWatch logs or with ECR. So as I was just mentioning, we have ECR. So, well, you have your containers and you want to store them somewhere. What are some of the options? So we have ECR, we have public repositories such as Docker Hub, and we are currently working on making it so you can use other third-party private repos. So say you have these containers, you want to take a look at them, see how they are doing, the status, then you would want to do some sort of monitoring. So this is where CloudWatch comes in handy. So we have our integration with CloudWatch. The application logs are sent to the CloudWatch logs and CloudWatch events. You can look at these inside of ECS or in CloudWatch itself. And then you can also set up scaling rules for your services, so you can monitor like service CPU and service memory utilization. So next comes storage. So with Fargate, you have ephemeral storage that is created for your application scratch space. At the end, when your task is terminated, it's terminated as well. We have there's the Docker layer storage which is at 10 gigabytes. And you can mount volumes and share them among your containers. And then the size of the mounted volume can be up to 4 gigs. So let's go into a demo of this. And hope that cool. I can't see it on my screen.
Display setting like a laptop that can show
Well,
big screen.
it's mirrored technically.
You're using Windows, so technically about it. So you display setting on a laptop.
I would if I could find my mouse. Does anybody see my mouse on that screen? Oh, wait.
You have to click on the arrow. Mouse hunt.
Shake the pointer back and forth and it should get bigger.
Well, maybe if I get myself back to PowerPoint. Alright, we're exiting PowerPoint. Sorry, guys.
Oh, that's probably.
There it goes. Alright. Okay, so this is, if you haven't been on before, this is the AWS console. There's a bunch of different services that you can go on here, such as ours, which is Elastic Container Service. Fargate's within this. So I'm just going to go click on that. Okay, so first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to go and create a task definition. So since we were talking about Nginx earlier, I'm just going to make one for Nginx. So if I go here, I just click create new task definition. So here's where you have the option of launch types. You can choose Fargate or you can go and use EC2. Okay, so you can give it any random name. I'm just going to randomly call it a name, because why not? You could give it task roles. I'm not going to for this example. So here you have AWS VPC. It doesn't let you change it because it is the only network mode that we support with Fargate. So I already created my test execution role, which you only need that if you are pushing to CloudWatch logs or anything that you want ECS to do for you. If you do the first run for Fargate, it will create this for you. So here, you next have to specify for how much memory and how much CPU that you want your task to use. Since Nginx is pretty small, I am just going to go with the smallest amount, which is 0.5 gigs. And then for the task CPU, I will use 0.25 vCPU. If you're manually typing this in for the task definition, then you have the option of specifying whether you want to use like gigabytes, etc., instead of having to use vCPU. Alright, so next I want to actually go and add the container. So I'm going to call it Nginx, and it will be pulling it from Docker Hub, and I will just call it Nginx. You have the choice of giving memory and CPU limits to each of your containers. Say, especially if I have multiple containers in my task, you can specify how much one has versus the other. I'm just going to leave it alone since I'm only running Nginx. For Nginx, it's on port 80, so I'm going to map it for container port 80. For AWS VPC, everything is running on the same network namespace. So if you have multiple containers, for instance, that you want to talk to each other, you can just use localhost. And say if I'm using Grafana, I would just have this instead at port 3000. And then you have other options of adding like the CPU units. You could have an entry point, such as a bash command if you're running busybox, etc. So the rest of this I don't need to touch at the moment, since I don't want to do anything special with it. So Fargate auto-configures CloudWatch logs for you. So the formatting is a little funky right now because I'm zoomed in. There we go. So you have like a group, a region, and you can change these if you want to. So I'm going to click Add. If I wanted, I could also configure all of this via JSON. So if I click that, this is like the little snippets that I was showing you guys earlier. And you have your container port, and if you change it in here, it's going to change it over there. So if you just have a task definition, you can just paste it in here instead of touching anything else if you wanted. Alright, so I'll just click create. Okay, so you can see that it created the task definition and that it created the CloudWatch log group. So say if I want to go and view the task definition. So it just specifies everything that we picked earlier, and you can still here you can see the JSON for it as well. Okay, so now if I decide that I want to create a cluster, you just go over to clusters and create cluster. Here you have the options of using network only, so that would be with Fargate. You don't have to worry about all the instances. And then you also have the options of EC2 Linux and networking or EC2 Windows and networking. So I'm going to go with the powered by Fargate. So anybody have a cluster name?
A cluster.
A cluster? Okay, so you can only have up to 5 VPCs. So I already have 5, so I can't go and create one, but if you haven't done this before, you would just click create a new VPC for this cluster. Alright, cluster successfully created. So if I go and view the cluster, you can see that there's nothing running on it, and clusters you can have running your EC2 tasks or your Fargate tasks on them. You just need to make sure that you have instances if you are trying to do EC2. Alright, so now that I'm on here, if I can have the option of creating a service or running a task, I'm just going to run a task so I don't have to worry about deleting it later. So you just click Run New Task, and then here you pick the launch type, so Fargate, and since it's alphabetical order, the task definition's right there, and a cluster too. So you can specify task groups, which I'm just going to leave alone. So then for VPCs, you can go and you can select a VPC, and within that there are different subnets, and they are associated with availability zones. So you have different regions, and within each region there's isolated availability zones. So I'm going to go and click these. If you remember a little bit earlier with that run task, it had the option, you had a flag and you included the subnets. So there's also a security group that it creates for you. If you take a look, right now it just has port 80 open. So say if I had Grafana and I wanted it to be port 3000, I would just go and add a rule for TCP and make it 3000. But that one works fine. So you can also give a public IP address. I'm going to do that so I can just go to that IP and CNNX. Okay, cool. So it created the task. So now if I look here, I can see my task ID, I can see the task definition I had, a family, the launch type, whether it's like Fargate or EC2, and the current status. So if I go to the task itself, you can see like it's in a cluster, the name, the last status of it. So with the network mode for AWS VPC, it attaches an ENI to each of your tasks. Since I picked having a public IP, this is the public IP for that. You can also click on the ENI ID and go into all of the details, but it's here for you.
Is the ENI IP a load balancer? Is it a ELB or it's assigned to the class?
The ENI is assigned to the task, not to the load balancer.
Okay, so, alright, cool, running. So now if I go to this IP address, since I'll already be port 80, moment of truth. Welcome to Nginx. And actually, since my task is still running and nothing's making it die or fail, I can just stop my task. Or I could run more, but I'm just gonna stop it. Or not.
Oh.
Not stopping my task.
No.
Why not?
That's
So
good.
that's, okay. Well, you gotta make money, right?
Go away.
There.
Okay, now to,
What was the problem with it?
I did not read through all of the text. I will look at my logs later.
No, send us a request ID.
Yeah.
Okay, cool. So I don't expect you to read all of this, because there's a lot of stuff on there. And this is mostly for if you have the slides later and feel like looking at it. So basically, Fargate is a launch type inside of ECS. It is not a separate service. And if you're trying to migrate between Fargate and EC2, we make that pretty simple for you to do so. You can still just run everything on the same cluster if you want. So I'll go to the next part. So like, if you want to learn more as well besides that, and I'll try sharing slides later. So we have our Fargate main page. We have an AWS compute blog, which is for all the compute services, so including all of containers. So we have a tag in there for AWS Fargate. Not everything is Fargate related is actually tagged at the moment. And then we also have, there's a YouTube video, which is the much more extended version of this talk. So, thanks. And if you have any feedback or whatever, and I'm directing questions to my friend Sam over there. You can come up ask me afterward, but he gets the fun.
Hey, I'm an engineer on the ECS team and helped to build the Fargate product.
So theoretically, it should be cheaper for limited tasks to run it on Fargate than on the EC2 base.
So our pricing details are online. I don't have them memorized, but it is pay as you go. It's just based on the resources that you're allocating memory and CPU for the task. Yep. In the back of it.
So Nginx needs a config file. How in practical terms do I put that into a container like with a volume mount?
So this is pretty similar to just using Docker containers elsewhere. In Fargate, you don't have files on a host that you can mount in, so it's something that you could bake into an image, or if you had it in the startup script at the beginning to go grab it from somewhere. Yeah.
So one thing that when you're using a new image from Docker Hub, you download it for the first time, but they have like a lot of repetition. Like you don't have to download it every time. This Fargate downloads the image every time I say on my task, 3 or 4 or 5. Like, would I have to download the Nginx image every time? Or is it cached?
So there is some amount of layer caching that's going on, but you should expect that you're going to download the layers. I generally would recommend that you have smaller container images, just as you'll hear from a lot of other people in the container community. So that's not too much of a big deal. Yeah.
I had a good question. So Elastic Beanstalk with multi-container support with ECS behind it. What's the story? Like, would those applications kind of transition well to Fargate, or?
They can. So
Can you repeat the question?
So the question is about Elastic Beanstalk, which has a multi-container platform that's basically powered by ECS, but it has a lot of the Elastic Beanstalk flavor going on with it. It's something that you could migrate to ECS if you're just running containers. You should be able to just take it and run it if you're not too baked into what Elastic Beanstalk is giving you. Yes?
You know, Fargate is planning on supporting some of the applications that are built on top of Kubernetes like Helm.
So the question is whether Fargate is going to support applications built on top of Kubernetes like Helm. So unfortunately, I can't really give what we're going in terms of the product direction here. We are interested in a lot of the same use cases that are being supported by things like that. Yeah,
I use placement groups so that all my containers show up in the same rack.
we do not support placement groups for Fargate yet. That's something that we've heard from a few customers. If you're looking for that type control over things that are close to the infrastructure, I would recommend using the EC2 mode because you can use all of the normal EC2 features with that.
Cool.
Anything? Yes.
The answer you gave to that person about having fewer layers.
It's about reducing the total size of the image, not about the number of layers.
Okay, reduce it. Okay, so would that ever be a topic for a meeting like this, a meetup, on how to optimize the Docker image?
Yeah, absolutely. And
Yeah.
and there's a number of talks online about it. So Abby Fuller, who's one of our
Technical evangelist.
technical evangelists, she gave a talk on optimizing container images at DockerCon. I think she also gave that
She
talk
gave it
at
at
re:Invent.
both DockerCons, and she's giving it at the upcoming DockerCon because it's awesome.
So
Is
there's a
that
bunch of
person
videos of
local
that.
here?
She's New York.
New York?
Yeah, there's a bunch of videos of that talk because she's given it a few times online, and I would definitely recommend that as a source for where you can learn about
Yeah.
optimizing.
It's
And-
called Creating Effective Images.
And people have suggestions for topics or companies that want to host, the Docker meetup, please let me know. I'm happy to hear.
So there was mention that the EBS volumes are, or the EBS backed volumes for Fargate are non-persistent.
Correct. We're not.
So you cannot
persistent storage
have
with
some
Fargate
kind of a
today.
persistent volume that you will remount between your containers or utilize EBS.
Correct. We don't have support for that yet. That is something that we've been hearing from our customers, and we'd like to add support for persistent storage in the future.
Cool.
Since a task in Fargate mode makes an ENI, is the maximum number of Fargate instances in a subnet just the number of IPs in that subnet until I run out of places to allocate ENIs to, or
The question
ENI
is,
limit?
since a Fargate task allocates an ENI, is the maximum number of Fargate tasks in a subnet the same as the maximum number of IP addresses in that subnet? The answer is pretty much yes. The number of unused IP addresses there. So there's a couple IPs that AWS uses out of your subnet just by default, so you won't be able to get a full range there, but it's not very many. Cool.
Awesome. Well, thank you. All right, we'll see you folks next month.
And there's stickers for that if you want to.